Raft has a complicated story. Hi friends, and welcome back to Raft. About 2 months ago, Redbeat Interactive released the 1.0 version of our favorite ocean floating simulator. That massive update came with plenty of changes to gameplay features and new content, but it also finished out Raft's very complicated and involved storyline. You see, the story in Raft is told through a series of small notes that you'll find scattered throughout the 8 story locations, so it's fairly easy to miss some of the finer details of the story, as well as get a grasp on the story as a whole if you're not paying attention to those details. As such, I've taken the liberty of condensing all 70 notes down into a comprehensive storyline for your viewing pleasure. If you enjoy the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It will be much appreciated. But without further ado, here's Raft, the story explained. You find yourself floating on a small raft amidst a seemingly endless ocean, but as your journal will tell you, if the waves seem endless, you simply aren't looking hard enough for the remnants of the world that remain. You are a forward scout, one of the surviving few whose mission it is to gather the remaining stories that you'll find scattered throughout a world sunken by climate change. After a period of drastic ocean rise, accompanied by a lack of action by the wealthy and elite, the world is as you see it now. Almost nothing but blue stretching out into an infinite horizon. For now, your mission is to survive and lead the way for anyone who comes after you. As you float, you'll encounter blueprints for some antenna and receiver, which, once you get running, will display a tiny blue dot amidst the endless blue that already surrounds you. After all, any radio signal that's still transmitting means that it's still above water, and if you choose to follow that little blue dot into the midst in hopes of finding dry land, that is where you will eventually stumble across the radio tower. This mass of concrete pillars sticking up from the blue became the makeshift home to 3 engineers when they stopped for the night to see if the radio still worked. The 3 engineers were given secretive nicknames by their secretive employers, and thus referred to each other as Sparrow, Cuckoo, and Owl. Sparrow stops talking to the other 2, and eventually takes the group's only boat to move towards a facility called Selene. Originally, all 3 engineers were supposed to travel to Selene together to help build some kind of prototype reactor, which is the only source of renewable energy in the sinking world. But with Sparrow gone, Owl and Cuckoo are left stranded at the radio tower. Owl thinks that Sparrow betrayed the group, while Cuckoo holds out hope that Sparrow might be trying to communicate through one of the many signals that the radio is picking up. Those signals reveal a distress call from Balboa Island, gunshots at Tangaroa City, a communication from Sparrow, who seemingly made it to Selene, a distress call from Varuna Point, and a collection of rafters headed towards some kind of Utopia. Maybe that's where Cuckoo and Owl disappeared to. Perhaps this little sticky note on the whiteboard will lead to where they went. The Vasagatan is a massive yacht owned by Swedish politician and former General Olof Wilkström. Olof, despite giving an interview stating that the people must band together during this crisis, instead chose to stock his modified personal yacht with goodies and friends to escape the rising water, instead of fulfilling his leadership duties in Stockholm to help save the general populace. Along with him on his little luxury cruise, Olof brought a small crew and a handful of guests aboard his lavish ship, which was complete with a dance floor, high-class bedrooms, and a stocked bar, yet lacked actual supplies that were necessary for the group's survival. The issues caused by a lack of supplies was exacerbated when mutated rats, called lurkers, appeared in the ship's hold, consuming half of the already limited supplies in short order. The ship's mechanic, Hannah, grows increasingly frustrated and concerned by Olaf's actions towards the crew, noting that Olof has a military background, and thus she thought he would at least be practical instead of prioritizing luxury over survival. Hannah herself regrets joining the voyage on the yacht, saying that it was ill-prepared and longing for her significant other, Ruben, who apparently left for one of the floating cities that Olof was supposed to be helping to create. Olof believes that his crew is incompetent and threatens to cut their rations, or flat out terminate some crew members over the food shortages. However, Olof also promises extra rations to anyone who can bring him a lurker alive. Someone evidently succeeded because Olof talks about creating an army of even stronger, more mutated rats that he has trained with food and pain as motivators to serve as his loyal soldiers. Olof even wonders if he could do the same to another species, which he hopes to test with the active animal population that he heard about in a transmission from Caravan Town. As the group's journey progresses, the situation around them becomes even more dire when the captain realizes that their maps are now useless and that they are more or less lost on an endless ocean. Olaf claims that the crew is planning to stage a mutiny against the captain and himself, to which the captain objects, defending that his crew is just trying to stay alive. Olaf interjects with somewhat of a threat to, quote, use the lurkers to our advantage. The internal conflict comes to a head when you can hear the sound of the ship grinding against solid rock. The captain's cry of "get to the lifeboats" rings clear across the ship, but it was already too late, because Olaf had taken the lifeboat for himself along with some of his prized new soldiers. The last thing we hear from the people of the Vasagatan are some distorted screams before the ship goes quiet. Balboa Island, formerly Balboa Nature Reserve, is a former mountaintop that now barely sits above the waves. 6 relay stations made up Balboa's communication network, with sets of engineers rotating through every 3 months to maintain the towers and keep the signals transmitting. Siblings Astrid and Bruno Correa were in charge of the ranger station on Balboa during the critical period of ocean rise, and their replacements never came, leaving the two stranded on Balboa without means of escape. Somewhere, somehow, by unknown means, Astrid disappears, leaving Bruno by himself to fend off the bears and keep the towers running. A single man driven mad by loneliness after his sister's disappearance, Bruno invents children for himself out of scraps left around the island. With bird cages for bodies, sticks for arms, and even a light bulb for a head, these so-called children become the fixation of Bruno's insanity, and he weaved his own narratives for his dolls, becoming intimately attached to their own invented personalities. Bruno becomes so invested in the stories of his made-up children that he opts to bring some of them along on his mission to find his missing sister Astrid, but there's a problem. He can only bring 2 of the children on the boat with him. Internally, this breaks Bruno to the extent where he has some of his dolls murder another one of his so-called children so that there might be space on the boat for them. And due to Errol's presumed demise, Bruno instead opts to bring Henry and Miranda with him on his journey, leaving Bobby behind to fend off the bears, and the triplets in charge of the relay station. Errol, still headless, remains at the ranger station while Bruno sets off to lands unknown. The people of Indonesia were among the first to adopt a way of life above the waves by making a series of rafts strung together to form their own raft towns. Caravan Town was no exception, but they were fortunate to find a scrap of land with populations of hyenas and mudhogs to anchor around. Due to the limited supply within the anchored town, only select people were allowed to stay on the island, and among them was the family of child scientist Dedo, along with his friend Sanjay. Dedo was determined to help his new community thrive in a sinking world, and started various science experiments in a mixture of childhood curiosity and a genuine desire to help the adults around him. These experiments included a water pump to help drain the ocean, a bike-powered diving suit, and a miniature rocket set to explore other planets. Dedo's experiments did cause the occasional stir with the Caravan townspeople, but his normal disruption would become obsolete when a newcomer arrives by the name of Olaf Wilkstrom. Suspiciously, around this time is when the butchers who cared for the mudhogs fell ill, and the sickness spread throughout the town. This infected both Dedo's mother and the town doctor. The doctor diagnoses the illness as salmonella, which had to be spread through the meat the town ate from the mudhogs, and the doctor strongly suspects that Olaf might have something to do with the sudden illness. Dedo and Sanjay have their own suspicions that Wilkstrom is not a good man, which is confirmed by their sneaking aboard Olaf's boat to see if there might be any medicine to save Dedo's mother. Instead, all Dedo finds are cages with big, angry rats and an abnormally large hyena. Sanjay even found notes about Olaf training the animals into his own personal army. Olaf himself decides to give a rather fraudulent speech to the people of Caravan Town, stating that he only left the Floating Cities project because they didn't want working-class people to share the benefits, which the townspeople had no way of knowing differed greatly from the reality of what happened on the Vasagatan. Olaf's speech ends by convincing the townspeople to take up arms and demand sanctuary in the nearby floating city of Tangaroa, which is where we'll see them next. One of those cities in the blue that the newspapers mentioned, Tangaroa boasted a large floating dome with a whole city contained in its walls. Complete with nicely decorated living spaces, shops for entertainment, and an agricultural bay, supposedly Tangaroa had everything you would need to maintain a healthy population in a sinking world, but such a feat of engineering was never meant to be. Tangaroa was built solely on a theoretical basis, but was thrust into use well before it was ready due to the increasing water levels, meaning that the project would never survive left to its own devices, let alone with the perceived threat of a front of rafters coming in over the horizon. Ruben, the lead engineer and the significant other to Hannah from the Vasagatan, is concerned that Captain James Tully wants to push the engines to their limits to outrun the incoming rafters, which Ruben fears will overheat the reactor that powers the city. Predictably, the engines start to fail. The situation above deck becomes even more desperate, with people already upset by the extreme food rationing caused by an infection of beetles among the plantation, now left to the mercy of the waves and the rafters coming closer by the hour. Captain Tully made the decision to defend Tangaroa by shooting to wound, regardless of the security chief's protests to use the non-lethal water cannons instead. The rafters do eventually make their way into Tangaroa, setting into some kind of guerrilla warfare by releasing mutated lurkers into the hold and strapping tasers onto the butler bots. In the scuffle, a small singular raft with a young boy floats into the water hold, and Ruben decides to take him in. This young boy is none other than Dedo, who helps Ruben repair a small vessel using an engine from one of the security team's patrol carts. Together, the pair leaves Tangaroa to search for the promised Utopia, stopping at Varuna Point along the way. While Tangaroa was at least fully constructed by the time it was deployed, the same cannot be said for Varuna Point, which was left abandoned due to the constantly rising water and the threat of the Grabber. The Grabber, a former construction worker turned kleptomaniac, took great joy in stealing from the construction project as it progressed, eventually causing the project to be abandoned due to the crew's growing fear of the invisible thief. The Grabber stashed all of his stolen treasures in a motherlode cache, but the rising water removed his access to his own prize. So instead, the Grabber satisfied his thieving needs by stealing from the unfortunate people who took temporary refuge at Varuna Point. Among them was Bruno, the crazed ranger from Balboa Island. He had climbed to the top of Varuna Point's large crane with a satellite dish to try to contact his sister Astrid, seemingly unsuccessfully. The Grabber took no pity on Bruno and stole one of his dolls, Miranda, the invented child. Of course, Bruno found this greatly upsetting and quickly left Varuna Point. Around the same time, Ruben and Dedo stumble onto the scene, only to have a set of old tools stolen from them before they too head for greener pastures. Or, in this case, colder ones. The frozen island in the South Pole boasts a small igloo town, an observatory, and a large nuclear reactor. Inside the observatory, we once again hear from Bruno, who is distraught by the loss of Miranda back at Varuna Point. He followed a signal far to the south with the wild hope to find Astrid, but he subconsciously worries about the dangers ahead. His fears aren't unfounded because polar bears wrecked the boat he arrived on. All would have been lost if it weren't for Dedo suddenly showing up. Dedo brings Bruno back to the infirmary in the igloo town, where Bruno assists Ruben in patching up his wounds after a bear attack of their own. The interaction with a real, living human seems to have triggered something deep within Bruno, and Henry stops talking back to him. Dedo was able to salvage materials to fix up Bruno's boat, and eventually the trio decides to head for a place with lots of people. Bruno leaves Henry behind, claiming that it would be best for someone to watch over Temperance. Traveling up to the reactor, properly known as the Selene Research Facility, Sparrow reveals that this is the reactor that she, Owl, and Cuckoo from the radio tower were meant to come maintain. Sparrow believes that Owl was a spy for the group of investors who, quote, caused this mess to begin with, while apologizing that she did not trust Cuckoo, because it was too much of a risk. Sparrow reveals that the Selene facility was built to master and perfect the experimental reactors that are used to power the floating cities, but they did not have the people to construct anything beyond a basic prototype. While the floating cities projects may all be failing, there's a place where the rafters live in peace with any survivors, called Utopia. But Sparrow receives a message from them stating that one of the investors, a certain Olaf Lokstrom, is taking control of Utopia, which is undoubtedly the location that Dedo, Bruno, and Ruben were headed for. Arriving in Utopia, glistening skyscrapers tower above the raft docks with colorful huts decorating the ground all the way up the sides of the various buildings. Despite all of the previous indications for a bustling city, Utopia seems strangely empty. The first inkling that something might be amiss comes in the form of two hyenas, which you vaguely remember hearing Dedo mention some hyenas in cages way back at Caravan Town. Your worst fears are confirmed when you approach that large hut towards the center of the city to find a note left by none other than Hannah, stating that Olaf has locked all of the Utopian citizens in that very hut, and it's up to you to save the day. Progressing through the various buildings in Utopia, you'll finally come face to face with Olaf himself. He is firmly in denial, believing that his investment in Utopia gives him the right to rule it, and that everyone else should bow down to him. He is willing to prove his point by sicking his army of hyenas on you. It all comes to a turning point when you inevitably defeat Olaf's prized mutant hyena Alpha and confront Olaf head-on. Olaf, the eternal coward, instead falls off of the ledge of Utopia's tallest skyscraper, only to be caught in a light strand below. From here, you can free the Utopian citizens and save Utopia once and for all.
When the ocean itself broke civilization, the survivors were left with nothing. Yet, they persisted. The forward scouts rose up from the wreckage, defied our flooded world, and brought back hope. Now Utopia stands free once again thanks to their actions. With this final chance, we can begin the slow and difficult road to recovery. From today on, we are all forward scouts, ready to discover the next step for humanity.
Now that the townspeople are free, you can listen to all of their unique backstories as well as finally meet Hannah, Bruno, and Dedo, whom you feel like you already know at this point. Ruben is somewhere in Utopia, but you'll never have the opportunity to meet him. Bruno still longs for Astrid and even wants to return to Balboa to retrieve the multiple someones he left behind. Sparrow left on a journey of her own to go back to look for Cuckoo. As for Olaf, the Community Council of Utopia will decide his fate, while he waits in one of his own cages. But for now, that's where the story to Raft ends. And sadly, that's likely where it will end forever, as the devs have confirmed that Chapter 3 was indeed the final update to the story, meaning that it's likely just bug fixes and minor content updates from here on out. But regardless of what the future holds, Raft tells an incredibly complex and meaningful story that's fraught with all of the ranges of the human psyche. It's very well told, but still very easy to misunderstand, which is why I hope that this video helped. Anyways, that's it for me for now. I hope you enjoyed. Please consider leaving a like if you did, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. It really helps me out. I hope to see you all again soon, but until then, have a great day.